They mocked the blind man at the bank, until he spoke one sentence. They laughed when he walked in with a white cane. The banker spoke slowly, as if he were a child. The blind man said nothing, until he opened his mouth and said one sentence that froze the entire room. The automatic doors of the bank slid open with a soft hum. A tall man stepped inside, his movements measured, calm, guided by a white cane tapping gently against the marble floor. His suit was neat but not flashy, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, with a silk tie that spoke of understated wealth. His face carried no tension, only quiet awareness. The morning light from the tall windows cast long shadows across the polished floor, but he navigated them as if he could see every detail. His leather shoes made barely a sound as he moved forward, the white cane sweeping in practiced arcs before him. People noticed the cane immediately. A young teller glanced at her colleague and whispered, "Does he know where he is?" Another employee smirked from behind the counter, nudging the person next to him. "Probably lost. Should we call someone? Maybe social services?" A third employee chuckled quietly while pretending to organize papers. The blind man paused near the reception desk, standing patiently, his head tilted slightly as if reading the room through sound alone. He listened to the hum of conversations, the clicking of heels on marble, the rustle of papers, the distant ding of the elevator. No one rushed to help him. In fact, several employees deliberately looked away, pretending to be busy with their screens or suddenly finding urgent tasks that required their immediate attention. The reception area buzzed with the usual morning activity, clients signing documents, phones ringing with their distinct tones, the coffee machine gurgling in the corner, the shuffling of feet as people moved between departments. But around this man, an invisible bubble of avoidance had formed. People walked past him, giving him a wide berth, as if disability might be contagious or as if acknowledging him would somehow obligate them to help. The receptionist saw him but chose to finish her personal text message first, then her email, then finally, reluctantly, she glanced up with an expression of mild irritation. When a banker finally approached, a man in his early 30s with slicked back hair and an expression of barely concealed impatience. His voice was overly gentle, dripping with forced patience. "Sir, do you need assistance?" he asked, enunciating each syllable as though speaking to someone who might not understand basic language. Each word was slow, careful, condescending. The tone you would use with a confused elderly person or a lost child. The blind man turned toward the voice with precision, his head angling exactly toward where the banker stood. "Yes," he replied calmly, his tone professional and even, betraying no emotion. "I'm here for a private meeting scheduled at 9:30 with the executive team." The banker hesitated, his smile faltering for just a moment as he glanced at his watch, then back at the man. "With who exactly?" he asked, already assuming this must be some kind of mistake or confusion, perhaps even a prank. The blind man gave a name that made the banker's eyebrows rise involuntarily. That name belonged to the executive vice president, someone who only met with major investors and institutional clients, someone whose calendar was protected by 3 layers of assistants. Still, the banker smiled politely, though his eyes betrayed his deep skepticism. "I'm afraid that person is very busy today. Are you certain about the appointment? Perhaps you have the wrong bank? There's another branch across town that handles—" "This is the correct location," the blind man interrupted gently but firmly. Behind them, quiet laughter echoed from a group of junior employees who had been watching the exchange unfold like entertainment during their morning coffee break. One of them muttered something about "wrong building," and another stifled a giggle behind her hand. A third employee whispered, $10 says security escorts him out in 5 minutes. The blind man's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly around the handle of his cane, the only visible sign that he had heard every word. They seated him in the waiting area, a leather chair near the window, far from the main desks, in a spot usually reserved for people waiting for loan rejections. "Someone will be with you shortly," the banker said, his tone making it clear that shortly was an indefinite promise, perhaps even a polite lie to make him wait until he gave up and left. Minutes passed. Then 10 more. Then 15. People walked by, glancing at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity to mild annoyance at his presence. Some assumed he was there for a small business loan he couldn't possibly qualify for. Others thought he was there by mistake, perhaps confused about which office he needed, maybe looking for a social services building. A few simply saw the cane and looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the reminder of vulnerability and difference. One woman even stepped around him in a wide arc, as though his blindness required extra physical space. The blind man remained perfectly still in his chair, his cane resting against his knee, his hands folded calmly in his lap. He didn't fidget. He didn't check his phone. He didn't show any sign of impatience or frustration. He listened. Footsteps approaching and receding. He could identify different people by their gait, their weight, the confidence or hesitation in their stride. Keyboard clicks from the teller stations, some fast and efficient, others slow and uncertain. Whispers that people thought were private, voices that carried further than the speakers realized. Is he still here? I think he's waiting for someone who doesn't exist. Should security escort him out? He's making clients uncomfortable. Maybe he's homeless. The suit could be from a donation center. He heard more than they realized. Every dismissive comment, every assumption, every judgment passed in hushed tones. His face remained calm, almost serene, but behind that composure was a mind cataloging every voice, every footstep, every detail. He knew who had laughed. He knew who had whispered. He knew who had looked away. His memory was exceptional, trained over years of navigating a world built for the sighted, where remembering voices and patterns meant survival and success. Eventually, after nearly 25 minutes, a senior banker approached. A man in his 50s with gray temples and an air of impatient authority. His expensive watch caught the light as he crossed his arms. "I'm sorry," the banker said softly, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "But perhaps you should come back another day. Or maybe call ahead to confirm your appointment. We have very strict protocols here." The blind man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the suggestion with genuine thoughtfulness. "Why?" he asked simply, his voice calm and curious. The banker shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but trying to maintain professional courtesy while also wanting this situation resolved. "Well, this meeting you're mentioning is for very serious financial matters. Large portfolios, complex transactions, international holdings. I'm sure you understand that we need proper verification, security clearances, multiple forms of identification." The implication hung in the air like smoke, unspoken but clear. People like you don't have meetings like that. People like you don't belong in spaces like this. The blind man smiled faintly, just a ghost of expression at the corner of his mouth. "So is mine," he said quietly. The banker's patience was wearing thin. He had important clients to attend to, quarterly reports to review, and this was becoming an awkward situation that he wanted resolved quickly and quietly. "Sir, I'm trying to be respectful here, but are you?" the blind man interrupted softly. The banker blinked. "Excuse me? Being respectful. Is that what you're doing?" The banker sighed, losing patience entirely, his professional mask beginning to slip away like paint peeling from a wall. "Sir, I don't think you understand how this bank operates. We have protocols, security measures, verification processes, regulatory requirements. We can't just let anyone walk in off the street and claim they have a meeting with our executives. Surely you can understand that we need to protect." The blind man raised his head, turning it precisely toward where the banker stood, and said calmly, clearly, with perfect enunciation, "If you delay me any longer, the offshore accounts tied to your Singapore branch will be exposed by tomorrow morning." Silence. Complete, absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, that presses against your eardrums. The banker froze mid-breath, his mouth still half open. The laughter stopped instantly, cut off as if someone had pressed a mute button. The clicking of keyboards ceased. Even the ambient noise of the bank seemed to drop away, leaving only the sound of the ventilation system humming overhead and someone's phone buzzing insistently in the distance. No one breathed. The banker's face slowly drained of color, going from a healthy tan to a pale gray in the span of seconds, like watching a time-lapse of decay. His hand trembled slightly as he brought it to his collar, loosening his tie. The banker's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. How do you know that?" he whispered, his voice cracking slightly, losing all its professional polish. "Only 3 people in the entire building knew about those accounts, confidential structures set up years ago, carefully hidden in layers of legal complexity, buried under shell companies and trust arrangements. Those accounts were never discussed in public spaces. They barely existed on paper. They certainly weren't mentioned in board meetings or official reports." The blind man turned slightly toward the sound of the banker's voice, his movements precise and deliberate. "I helped structure them," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard clearly throughout the now silent lobby. "Before I lost my sight. Before I stepped away from active practice." A pause heavy with implication. "I know every account number, every shell company, every transaction that's been flagged by international regulators but hasn't been acted on yet." Another pause, longer this time. "And I know who's been skimming from client accounts to cover the losses. I know the exact amounts down to the cent. I know which regulatory loopholes you've been exploiting. I know which auditors you've been paying to look the other way." The banker swayed slightly as if the words were physical blows. Around them, other employees had stopped pretending to work. Everyone was watching now, frozen in place. Phones began buzzing. First one, then another, then several at once, like a swarm of electronic insects. Executives rushed from their offices, their faces confused and alarmed, ties loosened, jackets hastily grabbed. Someone whispered urgently into a phone, their hand cupped around their mouth. "That's him. That's actually him. The consultant from the Hudson file. The one we thought disappeared." Another voice followed, higher pitched with panic. "He's the investor from the Jakarta merger. The one who vanished after the accident. No, he's more than that. He's the architect who set up our entire offshore division. He knows everything. Every secret, every account, every deal." The blind man stood slowly, his movements unhurried and confident, like someone who knew exactly where every piece of furniture was positioned. "I didn't come here for help," he said, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of panic like a blade through silk. "I came to finalize the acquisition." He paused, letting the words sink in, giving them time to understand. "I'm buying this bank." The executive vice president appeared at the top of the stairs, his face red from rushing, sweat visible on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Mr. Chen," he said breathlessly, nearly stumbling on the last step, "I apologize profusely. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. A catastrophic failure in our reception protocols." "No misunderstanding," the blind man, Mr. Chen, replied calmly, his voice cutting through the executive vice president's panicked rambling. "Just a test. I wanted to see how your employees treated someone they perceived as powerless. Someone they thought couldn't fight back. Someone they assumed had no value." He tilted his head, a gesture that somehow conveyed both disappointment and inevitability. "They failed. Completely. Every single one of them failed." Suddenly, chairs were pulled back throughout the bank. The sound of wood scraping against marble echoed like gunshots. Executives stood at attention, backs straight, faces pale. The same people who had laughed minutes earlier now avoided eye contact, their faces burning with shame and fear, their careers flashing before their eyes. Junior employees who had whispered jokes now stood frozen, realizing their careers might have just ended before they really began, that their student loans would come due without the salaries they had been counting on. The banker who had been condescending now looked like he might be sick, one hand pressed against the desk for support. The receptionist who had made him wait stared at her computer screen, unable to look up. Mr. Chin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to smile or gloat or make threats. He simply stood there, his white cane resting lightly in his hand, while the entire power structure of the bank rearranged itself around him like iron filings responding to a magnet. "The conference room," the executive vice president said quickly, gesturing toward the elevators with a shaking hand. "Everything is ready. All the documents are prepared. Our legal team is standing by. We can proceed immediately at your convenience, sir." Mr. Chin nodded once, a small movement that carried the weight of absolute authority. "Good. Let's not waste any more time than has already been wasted." As he moved toward the elevator, employees pressed themselves against walls and desks to give him space, as if he were royalty passing through. The same people who had ignored him now watched his every movement with fearful attention. The meeting proceeded quickly in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, with views that stretched for miles. Signatures were made with digital pads that Mr. Chin navigated using audio cues and practiced muscle memory. Documents were read aloud by nervous lawyers whose voices trembled slightly. Decisions were approved with swift efficiency, without negotiation, without debate. Legal teams that had been assembled spoke in hushed, respectful tones, adding "sir" to every sentence. Financial advisors presented portfolios with careful explanations of every detail, knowing that this man understood their business better than they ever would. When it was over, less than an hour later, Mr. Chin owned controlling interest in the institution. The paperwork that represented decades of history, thousands of employees, billions in assets, all transferred with a few signatures and verification codes. He stood to leave, and every person in the room stood with him, chairs scraping backward in unison. At the door, he stopped and turned back toward the room, his cane tapping once against the floor for attention. "I may not see faces," he said calmly, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone listen, that made even breathing feel intrusive, "but I hear respect, and I hear disrespect even louder." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Everyone who laughed today will be reassigned. Not fired, reassigned to positions where they'll learn empathy. Where they'll understand what it means to be underestimated, to be invisible, to be dismissed." "And the banker who made me wait?" The executive vice president swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "He'll be training new employees on disability sensitivity and unconscious bias. For the next year. Full-time. And his performance review will depend entirely on the feedback from the disability community." Mr. Chin nodded once, a gesture of satisfaction rather than mercy. "Good. Because this bank will change. Starting today. We will be the institution that sees value in everyone, not just the ones who look powerful." Then he walked out, his cane tapping steadily against the floor, each tap like a punctuation mark on the end of a sentence, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget this moment, who would tell this story for years, who would remember the day they learned that power has nothing to do with sight. As the elevator doors closed, the executive vice president turned to his team, his face still pale. "That," he said quietly, "is what happens when you judge a book by its cover. When you mistake visibility for value. When you forget that the most dangerous people are the ones you underestimate. Some people judge strength by appearance. Others mistake silence for weakness. But real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation or recognition. It waits, and speaks only when necessary. The most dangerous people in any room are those you dismiss. The ones you ignore. The ones you think don't matter. Because while you're laughing, they're listening. While you're underestimating, they're calculating. And when they finally speak, the entire world stops to listen. If this story reminded you never to underestimate anyone, subscribe for more billionaire stories where dignity always wins.